Hello, my name is Caden Roberts. This is my trip application video. I'm a finance student here at Texas A&M, and I will be walking through my process for both trip problems that I have done today. So it was the pipeline investment analysis and the beer estimation problem. So my goal for both was to take a structured, data-driven approach and to use logical assumptions and a clean Excel model that could finish with clear reasoning, just like you would analyze risk and or build a trade in the energy markets. And so let's start with the pipeline investment problem. So this one is more analytical and focuses on historical pricing data, risk, and profitability. So we were given historical input and output prices for 3 pipelines. We had pipeline A, B, and C. And so each pipeline's transportation costs and forward values. So the goal was to choose which pipeline I would invest in based on performance over time. And so in my Excel model, I had a sheet where I set up the daily profit for each pipeline as daily price minus the receipt price minus the cost. And so this shows the net margin you would earn for shipping gas through that line on a given day. And so once that was calculated for all 1,825 days, I summarized the results, which calculated the average daily profit, the standard deviation, and then I plotted a line chart so you could visualize the trends and the volatility of each pipeline. And so for pipeline A, the results came out to a consistently delivered small positive margins that were not huge, but they were very reliable. And so for pipeline B, we had the occasional big win where it would spike up, but mostly losses. So it's a very high risk, but low consistency profile. So for pipeline C, it hovered around the 0 mark. And so sometimes it was positive, sometimes it was negative, but not something you would want to invest in likely. And so if you think in an investor's shoes, pipeline A acts like a low volatility bond where it's a steady cash flow, whereas pipeline B is more likely the riskier option. It has your high upside days, but most of the time you would be losing money. And so pipeline C doesn't really compensate you for its risk. And so that's why I chose pipeline A. It might not be the flashiest option, but from a risk-adjusted return standpoint, it's the most investable. And so in energy trading, the consistency and predictability is typically what ends up outperforming the speculation in the long run. And so let's transition to the beer estimation. So to switch gears to something more conceptual, I estimated how many unopened beers were in College Station at 3 a.m. before the Florida game. And so this was less about a perfect data and more about structured reasoning. And so I treated this like a Fermi estimate. And so breaking the city into logical categories that would physically hold unopened beer at that moment. And so my 5 categories I used households, I used retail stores, I used bars and restaurants, and then Kyle Field, the pre-stock, and then I used the hotels and short-term rentals. All different categories that could lead me to a logical answer. And so I started with households. So based on the data that I had, there were about 44,700 occupied households in College Station, including apartments. And so I estimated about 65 of them had beer on hand, which averaged about 14 beers each, which is roughly 1 12-pack plus a few extras. And so this gave me around 406,770 beers from just homes alone. And so next were the retail stores. And so big grocers, smaller markets, and convenience stores. So I assumed that each has a set amount of cases in the back stock. I multiplied by 24 beers per case, and this added a 1.2 weekend uplift on the percentage of the beers. And so since game weekends always mean extra inventory, this came out to about 171,500 beers in retail. So for bars and restaurants, I used my own experience working in hospitality. So on a big weekend, the average bar might have around 2 unopened kegs and 10 cases left after closing. And so if I used a mix of half and sixth barrels, and again applying that 1.2% uplift, I got roughly 55,000 beers. So then I factored in Kyle Field, which can hold around 102,000 people. And since this game was at max capacity, that was the number that I decided to use. So if they stock about 1.5 beers per attendee the night before the game, that's about 153,000 beers on site. So finally, I added hotels and Airbnbs to that number. Around 6,000 rooms was my estimate, with maybe 20% of the room attendees that had a six-pack in their fridge in their room. And so that came out to about 8,640 beers. So when you add everything together, the total came to about 795,000 unopened beers in the city at 3 a.m. And so I ran a range estimate too. So about 635,000 on the low end and just over 1 million on the high end. So I multiplied that by the 0.8 and the 1.3 to find that range. So the biggest takeaway was that most unopened beer sits in households and retail, while the rest comes from this short-term inventory built up in bars and stadiums before a major event. So overall, both problems came down to building models from logical assumptions, and I explained my reasoning clearly. I wanted to show that I can approach uncertainty the same way I'd approach risk. So I defined the variables, I quantified them, and then I explained my decision confidently. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate the opportunity to apply for TRIP.